Okay, we are again in Perek Tes of the Talmud Devorah, and the particular context that we're discussing is how does one connect to the Sphira of Malchus, which is the 10th of the Spheras, and Malchus is Shechinah, Malchus is feminine. How are you mizdabek in that Sphira? How do you connect? Really, so when we say the phrase that everybody says all the time, how do you connect to the Shechinah? That's a common phrase, Shechinah imai. So from a Kabbalistic standpoint, you're not just talking about generically how to connect to God, but you're referring very specifically to this particular aspect of God that's called Shechinah. And we went over the idea that the basic quality is, number one, humility, and that is because Malchus is zero. Malchus has no characteristic other than absorbing all of the light that comes from everything else and then passing it on. Malchus is the feminine that absorbs everything and then sends it forward, just as a woman gets pregnant and gives birth. And therefore, the lashon of the Zohar is, Leslei migarmei klum, it has no characteristic of its own. So too, when I make myself an anaf, in which I am just a conduit for the glory of God, and I don't bring my ego and my gaiva in, then I am connected to Malchus because I'm emulating the facet of Malchus, Leslei migarmei klum, that there's nothing I have of my own. Now, this also means, this is one of the reasons why the Jewish calendar is a lunar-based calendar, right? The Jewish calendar is based on the revolutions of the moon around the earth, as opposed to the solar calendar, which is the revolution of the earth around the sun, heliocentric. And as you know, there are 11 days difference, approximately, I don't have to be exact here. There are 11 days difference between a lunar year and a solar year. So a lunar year on the average is 354. A solar year on the average, I know I'm approximating, is 365, 11 days. And that explains why, of course, any given lunar date will get progressively earlier and earlier and earlier. So if Pesach, year 1, is April 15, year 2, it'll be April 4th, year 3 will be in March. And that is why we have to, every 7 out of 19 years, we have to add an extra month in order that Pesach should be in the spring. Right? The Islamic calendar is totally lunar. That's why Ramadan can be any time of the year. It can be the winter, it can be the summer. Summer Ramadans are especially hard because, it's a long summer day, it's hot. But Judaism is a lunar, Jewish law is a lunar calendar with a solar adjustment in order to kind of, when Pesach gets too early, we kind of push it forward to keep it in the spring. But the general idea that the Jewish people are compared to the moon rather than the sun is based on the notion that unlike the sun, which shines with its own light, the moon has no light. The moon only reflects the light of the sun. Right? Whatever you see of the sun, of the moon, is a reflection of the light of the sun, and therefore the concept is the goal of my life is to be a reflection of the glory of God, to be a receptacle of God's glory that I then pass on. That's the characteristic of Malchus, the kingship of David HaMelech. That is the characteristic of the Jewish people, and that, the anava, that humility, is how I connect to the Sphira of Malchus. I am mizdabek b'Shechinah by emulating that aspect of the Shechinah. Yeah.
Why did Hashem create the desync between the moon and the sun? Like, what's the, for our purposes, like, what's that for?
Why? I didn't hear you. Why what?
The moon doesn't match the solar cycle. Like, it gets pretty good.
Oh, why the cycles are not matched?
Right. Why did he desync them in like a subtle way?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, Hashem could have slowed up the moon so it would be the same amount of time. But maybe you need a difference so we know that we're following the lunar cycle, meaning if they matched up, you wouldn't really know that you're following the lunar cycle because you might be following the solar cycle. So you need to make the differentiation. Yeah.
Is a woman by nature more humble, seeing as Malchus is such a feminine thing, and
Yes, that's true. Malchus, once again, is feminine, and it receives, and after it receives, it then gives forth. So that would be connected to a sense of humility as well. Now, again, that doesn't mean every single woman is more humble than every single man. That's certainly not the case. But there is a certain humility quality in women, and let me explain what that is exactly. That doesn't mean a woman walks around bent over saying, I'm nothing. But the humility of a woman, again, I'm generalizing, is the willingness to accept from others. This is a very important point. It's a well-known phenomenon. It's almost become a joke that the major difference between men and women is men don't like to ask directions, and women love to ask directions. Now, Baruch Hashem, with Waze and GPSs, which were invented by men, we don't need to ask directions anymore, so that's why they were invented. That was the motivation. But I remember myself in the olden days before there was Waze and GPS, so we'd be going on a trip with my wife somewhere. So as soon as we're in the driveway, we didn't even leave yet. So she would say, let's ask directions. And I got to be lost at least 3 hours. Then I break down eventually, but I'm not going to ask directions. I'm not going to ask directions until I'm really, really, really desperate. Now, it's a joke. It's a well-known joke, and it happens to be true, actually. Men don't like to ask directions. But what is the idea? The idea is the old male ego, and that is to say, when I ask directions, I'm admitting my powerlessness. I'm admitting my weakness. I'm admitting my ignorance. I don't want to do that. I don't want to reach out and tell people that I don't know something, as small as it might be. A woman is much more willing to connect to others, and that actually is a sign of humility. Now, the Zohar says there are profound reasons for that, because the Zohar takes the position, it's a machlokes in the Gemara, how do you understand the creation of Adam and Chava? According to one Mandiyamar, first there was man, the male, and later God took part of the male and made it into a woman. Meaning first there was man, and then God made woman. But there's another opinion in the Gemara that God made man and woman together simultaneously, but they were connected, like Siamese twins, although it was back to back, a little awkward, it was back to back, and the creation of woman means separation. But the Zohar goes with the first opinion. First there was man, and then God made woman from man. So think about it. The essential nature that you have is connected to the first moments of your creation on earth. Man was born into a world of isolation. Man was born into a world where he was the only human being. Later, he was joined by a partner, because it's not good for man to be alone. But his essential identity was aloneness. And because his essential identity was aloneness, his sense of self is bound with self-sufficiency, autonomy, control. That's why everything is a threat. The woman was born into a world of relationship. Man existed without woman. Woman never existed without man. There was another person from the beginning of her creation. Now that's very significant, because what that means is that for a woman, relationships, reaching out, connecting to others, is part of her essential nature in a way that is less so for a man. So, you can call it in modern terms, you can call it male ego, you can call it competitiveness, you can call it any label you want to give it. But the Zohar says it goes back to very deep existential notion of the foundation of man, which is why, it's a long-winded answer to your question, this is why a woman has the quality of humility, not because she's necessarily self-consciously humble, but because she does not view connecting to others as a threat. In fact, one might even say, but in a speculative thought, I have no particular source for this, that women cannot count for a minion, at least in the Orthodox ritual. Now, why not? After all, men, women, we have the same God, same Torah. And part of the idea is because minyan is a corrective to male self-sufficiency. because the man wants to be self-sufficient. I want to feel I can do everything myself. So what does Minyan tell me? No matter who you are, you could be the Gadol Hador, you could be Rav Chaim Kanevsky, you could be Moshe Feinstein, you could be Moshe Rabbeinu. There's some stuff you can't do unless you connect to other people. You need to connect to other people. Minyan is like the ultimate test, or the ultimate statement, that there are certain things in life I cannot do alone, no matter how great I think I am. So, like many, many things in Judaism, the people who need it are the people who need the corrective, meaning men need minyan, so they count for a minyan. Women don't need minyan because the sense of community is naturally ingrained from their very first moments of creation. But that's the connection between women and humility. So humility is the main point of connecting to Malchus, to Shechinah, and then he talked about Galus, going into exile as a way of acquiring humility. We talked about that. And then he talked about, the Ramak talked about Yiras Hashem, which does not mean fear of punishment, but it means an overwhelming awe and reverence for Hashem's infinite greatness, to have a sense that Hashem is watching me at all times, and to have a sense that when I sin, I am besmirching God's palace because the source of my soul is in Shemayim. So when I do an Aveira, I'm not just metame me, but I'm metame the makom of the Kisei HaKavod. And finally, when I sin, I drive the Shechinah away from Kudsha Brichu, and therefore it's as if I'm interfering Kavyachol with God's marriage. So these are 4 meditations. Just to I'll list them again quickly to be sure you get them. There are 4 aspects to what is the reverence I have for God. One is I'm overwhelmed with his infinite greatness and power. Number 2, I'm overwhelmed with the idea that he watches me always. So there's nothing I could ever escape from, always. As Pirkei Avos says, Ayin Raya, there's the eye that always sees. Ozen Shamas, the ear that always hears. V'chol, this is in Pirkei Avos, V'chol ma'asecha, b'sefer nichtavim. And all that we do and think is inscribed, as it were, in the permanent book. Right, so that's the second, right? So the first is the infinite power and beauty and perfection of God. The second is the notion that everything I do does not escape his notice, which includes everything I think. Number 3 is that a person realizes that when they sin and they're pogame, they besmirch their soul, they are besmirching their soul at its root. And the root of all souls comes from the breath of God. So it's as if it were, you're going into the king's palace and you're breaking the glasses and you're breaking the dishes and everything else. And the final meditation is that when I do Torah and mitzvahs, I'm creating unification between the Shechinah and Kudsha Brichu. My Averos separate husband and wife. Again, I've said many times already, the notion of yichudim, unifications within God, is a very problematic idea. Some say, how can you talk about God being unified, God being separated? What does that even mean? There's only one God. Okay, so I don't know. And that's why the Shem Yichud Kudsha Brichu was very, very criticized. The United Yehuda was against the recitation of Yichud Kudsha Brichu Shechinte, but whatever it would be, Kabbalah uses the marital relation of husband and wife to metaphorically describe what happens when everything comes together and divinity flows, gives a blessing to the world. That is described as the yichud of Kudsha Brichu Shechinah. And when you do Averos, you are driving a wedge into that yichud. Right, so these are 4 meditations regarding Yira. Now, the next part, I was a little, I'm sorry, yeah.
So the next thing you were saying that the responsibility, what's written down is not only our actions, but also our thoughts.
Yep.
So I thought thoughts, but for our actions. We can think a certain thing, but not follow through with it.
No. So it's 100% true that Hashem does not judge a bad thought equivalent to a bad action. That is true. But that doesn't mean thoughts are ignored totally. Now, it is true that sometimes there are thoughts I have no control over. They just enter, and Hashem is not going to hold me accountable for that. But there are other times in which, you think a certain way, and you would be capable of changing your thought process by work on it, and Hashem will hold you accountable for not refining your thoughts in a proper way or not avoiding the stimuli that cause you to have improper thoughts. So yeah, thoughts are not as bad as actions, but that does not mean they don't count. They do count for something. Okay, now the next thing I'm a little reluctant to say because I don't want anyone to feel bad, but the Ramak discusses the idea, remember, since Malchus is Shechinah, then when we talk about Devekus in the Shechinah, Devekus, cleaving, connecting to the Shechinah, we're talking about connecting to Malchus, right? That's the subject of the chapter. So he makes the point, almost as an aside, it is a davar pashut that until a person is married, there is no way they can be davuk to the Shekhinah. Because the Shekhinah connects to you only in the merit of your wife. Now, you have to understand what this means exactly. This does not mean, God forbid, that you can't have a connection to Hashem. Of course you have a connection to Him. You're learning, you're davening, your mitzvahs. But once again, an intenser level, a greater level of devekus occurs after marriage. And he says it's a davar pasha. In fact, this even explains the hanhaga that, although some people are cholak on this, but the Mishnah Berurah brings opinions that even if a person wears a talis when they're single, right? Well, that's issue number one. First of all, let's take issue number one. Among most Ashkenazim, people who are not married do not wear a talis gadol unless they're called for an aliyah or davening for the yomid. So let's first ask that question. What does a talis have to do with being married? I mean, there's a mitzvah of tzitzis. Obviously, single people and married people do have a mitzvah of tzitzis. And if the optimal mitzvah of tzitzis is fulfilled not only with the talis katan, but also with the full talis, then logically, single people and married people ought to be exactly the same. So as you know, Sfardim do have the minhag of single, most Sfardim, single people wearing talis. And Yekis, the Jews from Germany, the old German minhag was that single people wore talis because Maishna, what difference would it make between single people and married people? But a non-Yeki Ashkenazim, Poland, Russia, etc., the minhag was that single people do not wear a talis. And the Mishnah Berurah brings from the Mariel, which is a little strange because Mariel is actually the greatest of the German poskim, and he actually gives the reason not to wear a talis, even though Lamaisa Yekis wear talis. But the Mariel says it's based on very, very strange reason. It's based on a drasha, but it's a drasha that doesn't appear in the Gemara. Like when do we make halachas from we make a drasha? And that is that next to the tzitzis, mitzvah of tzitzis in Parshas Ki Seitzei, it says ki yikach ish isha, when a man marries a woman, etc. And then after it talks about get and divorce and the laws, it then mentions you should wear tzitzis. So they darshan a smichas, they darshan a juxtaposition that only the person who married wears tzitzis. Again, this is a tremendous, tremendous chiddush, because this is not a smichas that the Gemara says. Chazal don't say it. So give me any other example where we make a drasha. We say, we juxtapose two psukim, and we make such a halacha. Nevertheless, as you know, the minhag among non-Yeki Ashkenazim is not to wear a talis until you're married. Of course, once you're married, then even when you're divorced or widowed, you continue to wear a talis. You don't take off your talis at that point. Now, the Mishnah Berurah brings, however, that even among those who have the minhag of wearing a talis, you should not cover your head with the talis until you get married. Now, some people are cholak in that as well, But still, it says, that's why a yeki might wear a hat or whatever it would be. The kisui of the talis is the unique privilege of a married man. Now, why would that be so? So, al pi Kabbalah, it's musbar like this. The concept of covering your face with a talis is based on the notion that you're connected to the Shechinah and you cover your face in awe of the Shechinah. So Memela, since Hashras Hashchina on a person is connected to him being married, so until you're married, you don't have the Hashras Hashchina, so there's no reason to cover your head with a talis. That would be the svara for those who do not cover their head with a talis. But again, as I say, that itself is not an exclusive minhag. There are some opinions in which they even they cover their head with the talis as well. Yeah. Yeah.
So the drasha which doesn't let most Ashkenazim wear the talis gadol is because there's no. How come we can still wear talis katan if the pasuk was about tzitzis in general?
Yeah, it's a good question, but I guess everything has to be answered. We're obviously not going to make a drasha that Chazal didn't say to totally take away the mitzvah legamri. That would be a little beyond us. But as a smichus, to kind of say don't wear a talis gadol, that they're willing to make a drasha for, to make a distinction between the chashivas of a married person and not. But as I say, either way, it's still going to be a difficult thing. Yeah.
Like one person retains the rights or the ability to wear the talit gadol.
Yeah.
But does that mean that they also retain that connection to the Shekhinah, or when they get divorced, do they lose that connection?
Yeah, so it seems that they might lose it, actually, and that's what I want to talk about. So I don't want anyone to get disheartened, really. First of all, Mir Hashem, you'll all get married, and B'Shah Taiva, and the point is, even beforehand, there are all sorts of ways we do connect to Hashem. In fact, the Ramak will even talk about this. In spite of what he just said, he'll then talk about connecting to the Shekhinah when you're not with your wife. So don't get despondent, but he just says, almost as a throwaway line, Dover Pashut, that before a person is married, he is not davuk in the Shechinah, because his devekus in the Shechinah is bischus ishto. And the way he explains it, the Shechinah is mashpia on you, all sorts of brachos, so you can then pass it on to your wife. So she is the reason why you get all the brachos. Now, Chazal, in truth, Chazal say this, but they don't say it about Shechinah. Chazal say it generally, that ein bracha mitzuya bebeisa shel adam ela b'schus ishtei. Blessing comes into your home in the merit of your wife. Now, again, Chazal didn't describe it as Shechinah, but this is how the Ramak is understanding it, that I am mizdabek in the Shechinah in the merit of my wife, therefore I receive spiritual light that I can then pass on. So you see the interesting idea. I'm passing on a spiritual light to my wife, so she's getting it from me, but I'm getting it only because of her, right? So man gets it from the Shechinah in the merit of his wife, and then he passes it on to his wife. So the question is, who's giving to whom? His wife is getting it from him, but he got it from God only in the merit of his wife, so he could pass it on. It's very interesting, reciprocal giving and receiving type of situation, that the bracha is mitzuya bebeisa shel adam bischus ishtei. Now he then goes on to a little, and now he says the following. This is a bit of a heavy Kabbalistic symbolism, but he says a man is supposed to be between two women. How does it work? The Shechinah, which is feminine, is mashpia on the man, so he could be mashpia on his wife. So effectively, he's between two feminine entities. He is between Shechinah and Isha. And he then says that lower level connection of the two wives is mirroring something that's taking place at a much higher level. Now, let me remind you, if you go back to the highest level of the spheros that are beyond the lower seven, Chesed Gevurah, going back to the brains of God, the moach of Hashem. So we had Keser, Chachma, Bina. Now you'll remember, Keser is will. That's the thing that starts everything. That's the will of Hashem to do something. Chachma is the masculine element. Bina is the feminine element. Chachma unifies with Bina and produces the spheros. And the dominant sphera is called Tiferes, because Tiferes is the combination of Chesed and Gevurah. So Tiferes is Makabel from the feminine Bina, and then passes the Hashpa'ot to the feminine Malchus. So Tiferes itself is between Bina, that is called Ima Ilah, the upper mother, and Malchus, which is Ima Tata, the lower. So the same way Tiferes receives Shefa from the upper mother and passes it to the lower, so too the human being receives Shefa from Malchus that it passes to his physical wife. In other words, what the human being is doing is mimicking a spiritual process that's taking place at a much, much higher level. And again, Tiferes is connected to Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu is the ideal human being because his face is on the Kisei HaKavod of Hashem. And therefore, we are the lower Yaakov, and we're mimicking what the upper Yaakov is doing, etc. Okay, again, just to describe the imagery, I can't do much more with this. But this is the notion of the Shechinah is nistabek with me when I am mechaber myself to my wife. Right? So that's the idea that Hashras HaShechinah is b'schus ishtay. I receive from the Shechinah, I then pass it on. So then he brings a fascinating passage from the Tikkunei Zohar. Now let me just explain a little bit. No, the book that's called Zohar, actually the whole idea of the Zohar is an interesting idea. We commonly say that the Zohar was the composition of the great Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, whose yahrzeit was observed on Lag BaOmer, and even though normally a yahrzeit is a sad day, but as I think I mentioned, one of the reasons it was so happy is on the day of his death, before he died, he revealed the great secrets of Kabbalah that are in the Zohar, so that became a joyous day of revelation. Now, as you know, or you may know, the problem is this: the Zohar was not discovered as a book. This is before printing, until the 1200s. And it was said to be discovered in a cave by a rabbi, Rabbi Moshe ben Leon, who said this is the long lost work of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it was called Sefer HaZohar, and it was then publicized, it was copied, recopied in manuscript, and eventually when printing was invented in the 15th century, it became printed. So nobody knew about this book called the Zohar until Moshe de Leon. I'm sorry, not Ben Leon, Moshe de Leon. So ever since then, there's been a lively controversy. Is the author really Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai? Or is the author Moshe de Leon? Now, there's 1,000 years between them. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai lived after the Churban Bayesheni. He lived in the first and part of the 2nd century of the Common Era, the 100s and the like. Moshe de Leon lived in the 1200s. The 1200s. So if the Zohar is Moshe, now that means the Zohar is not a new book. In other words, the Zohar wasn't yesterday. But is the Zohar from the year 150? Or is the Zohar from the year 1250? 1,000 years. Many say, or many said, that the Zohar was simply a reverse plagiarism, right? Plagiarism is when I write something under my name that really should have been under your name. Reverse plagiarism is the opposite. I write something and I credit it to somebody much earlier. So some say Moshe de Leon happened to be a Kabbalist and he wrote a book of his own ideas that he called the Zohar. So this was a big controversy. In the academic world, the secular academic world, Moshe de Leon is assumed to be the author of the Zohar. Our Messiah, however, and this is from the Arizal, from the Gra, from the Ramchal, is that the Zohar is indeed from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. As far as I know, the only traditional Makar who suggested that it might be Moshe de Leon is Rav Yaakov Emden. So Rav Yaakov Emden does acknowledge that as a possibility. But as I say, Arizal, Gra, Ramchal all say the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So you sometimes hear in the yeshiva world, anybody who says that the Zohar is Moshe de Leon is an apikoros. That's not a true statement. You're not an apikoros. The authorship of the Zohar to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is not one of the 13 principles of faith. So if you took that position, I would not call you an apikoros. But you do need to understand that this is the opposite of the position of the Vilna Gaon and the Arizal and the Ramak and Rav Chaim Vital and really all the Mekubalim and the Ramchal. So if you were to say Rav Shimon Bar Yochai didn't write the Zohar, we would describe that as a mistake, but not a heresy. Not every mistake is a heresy. People can make plenty of mistakes. You're not an apikoros because you made a mistake. Okay. Now, here's the thing, though. I'm going to qualify this. Even if we accept the teachings of the Arizal and the Gra, that the Zohar is from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, let's accept that because that is what is makubal. That doesn't mean every single word of the Zohar is that old. It's a davar pashut ma'id that things were added to the Zohar from later times. And the proof of this is pretty simple. The Zohar mentions names of Amoraim who lived hundreds of years after Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. The Zohar mentions words in Spanish which may connect it to Moshe de Leon. So, the same way we say, let's take Sefer Tehillim. I ask you, who wrote Sefer Tehillim? So you're going to answer me, David HaMelech wrote Sefer Tehillim, which is true. But within Sefer Tehillim, the Gemara itself says that David HaMelech wrote the basic majority of Sefer Tehillim. But there are individual psalms from Adam HaRishon, from Moshe Rabbeinu, and even people who came after David. So when you say somebody is the author of a certain book, that doesn't mean every single letter in the book is from that author. So from the Zohar, it's a davar pashut that we believe that the core of the Zohar is from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, but there were hosafot that were made later. The question then becomes, how late are your hosafos? Because it's one thing to say Amoraim added something. It's another thing to say Moshe de Leon added something, meaning how late was the process of addition? No later than Moshe de Leon, for sure. Because the Zohar we have was the Zohar he brought out. But did he make additions to the Zohar? Who knows? It is a possibility that he did. He was a great Makubal in his own right. But that doesn't contradict the basic Masorah that this is fundamentally the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So what I'm espousing here is kind of a middle position, right? Some people say, oh, the Zohar is Moshe de Leon. And some people say every word of the Zohar is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. what I think is emes is that the core of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. There were Hosafot that were made later, although we're not sure if Moshe de Leon made them or they're from earlier sources like Amoraim in the Gemara itself. Yeah.
Those parts of the Zohar that we're not quite sure who added them, how do we know those are valid?
Right. So the question So the question now becomes one of authority. Right? The Zohar we treat as a holy book. We treat as an authoritative book. We treat as a book that we follow. Now, if it's all from Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, of course, he's a great Tana, so I follow him. But if these were things that were added later, then who says I have to follow them? So the answer would be this. One of the reasons why we follow the Zohar, I mean, we don't always follow it, but that we look at the teachings as holy, is not necessarily because of its origin, but because the great Gedolim consider it to be a valid teaching. Meaning to say, if the Vilna Gaon or the Arizal tell me that these are true teachings, then it makes no difference, actually. Is it from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or is it Moshe de Leon? Because I have all of these Gedolim that say, this is emes. I mean, let's imagine you would write something, and you presented it to the Vilna Gaon, such a big zechus. And the Vilna Gaon said, this is emes li'amitai, right? Supreme compliment. Emes li'amitai. So I couldn't say, oh, you wrote it. Why? It doesn't mean anything. But it makes no difference that you wrote it. The Vilna Gaon said it was emes. So I think a lot of the Zohar, see, people make a mistake here, and they think that the historical question of authorship determines why the Zohar is authoritative. The emes is, it doesn't turn on that. Even if there are parts of the Zohar that are written later, given the fact that all of the greatest of our Gedolim have said, this is emestika Torah, that makes it emes, regardless of who wrote it, you see? So that's why I think sometimes there is less that turns on authorship of Zohar than people think. People seem to assume, oh, once it's not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it's nothing. That's not emes. It'll still be a holy and sacred work. Yeah.
I read somewhere that, according to Rav Chaim Kanievsky, he said that if you deny that it wasn't written by Rashbi, then you would be heresy. So how do we rectify that?
Well, all right, I guess I'm wrong. I mean, what Rav Chaim Kanievsky said is not universally accepted. I don't want to get into being cholik with someone that I'm not worthy of being cholik in, but not everyone agrees. But the thing is, but even Rav Chaim was not addressing every word of the Zohar. In other words, I think he was saying those who disassociate Rashbi from the Zohar might be doing something wrong, but I think he would be moda, there were Hosafos. And the Hosafos are also authoritative, but they may have come later. Yeah. By the way, even in the Gemara itself, the Amoraim are the people who wrote the Gemara, or did the Gemara, and we normally say the Talmud was finished in the time of Ravina and Rav Ashi. But after the Amoraim, there was a mysterious group of people between them and the Gaonim, and they're called the Saburaim. And they did like final editing of the Gemara, and they added some stuff. And they're actually what you might call post-Rav Ashi editions in the Gemara itself. So the notion that, again, we wouldn't accept that about the Torah, chas v'sholem, but in terms of rabbinic works, there is a concept of adding to it later, and things can be done that way without detracting from their authority. Yeah.
So if you were to be able to pick apart the Zohar word and say, okay, this word is Rashbi, this word is Mufti,
Yep.
the first word, could you then say, okay, the words that Rashi wrote there tonight, and then make it override the Amorex versus the Gemara because it's a Tana against the Gemara?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. On the other hand, we do have a klal in halacha. It's an interesting question that basically says that when there's a machlokes between the Zohar and the Gemara overrides the Zohar. Now you're asking the question, but wait a second here. It's not just a machlokas Zohar and Gemara. What if it's a machlokas Tana and Amora? So shouldn't we apply the rule that a Tana overrides an Amora? That's a very excellent question. But apparently, if it's a Tanaic view that was not incorporated in the Talmud itself, even though it is a view of a Tana, it would not necessarily be authoritative enough. So there are nafkaminas where a Tana's view is recorded. A Tana's view in the Gemara, in the Talmud, is different than a Tana's view outside of the Talmud. But it's a good question. I want to think about it a little bit. Yeah.
They say that Rashi knew all of the Gemara, and he knew like not necessarily he could see the future, but like he was all the Gemara that was going to be that was going to come out in the future, and how the discussion of the Zohar.
You know, some do want to say that. Some want to say it was the nature of prophecy, prophetic revelation of the future. But you know, I find it a little difficult because these people are quoted, meaning to say, Abaye says this, Rav says this, Shmuel says this. It's a little hard to say that he wrote down verbatim the words they are going to say. But you know, as I say, I mean, some would say what you're saying, so I'm not dismissing it. Okay, yeah.
Did anyone try to say that Moshe Dayan was like a Gilgal of Rav Shimon Bar Yochai and cheat their way out like that way, or?
Some would say it. I think Moshe Dayan may have said it. that may actually have been his belief. There's a whole story. I think was it. I mean, there were opponents of the Zohar because they claimed, you know, when it first came out, that they claimed that when somebody bought the manuscript from his wife, and she said, my husband made the whole thing up. But again, these are bit of Lashon Hara stories that were being made by people who wanted to discredit the Zohar. So I wouldn't necessarily pay attention to it, but there were such stories going around. Yeah.
How did Shimon Bar Yochai receive the Zohar?
Yeah, so the pashtus is that the receiving was through a process called Giloy Eliyahu, meaning Eliyahu Navi, who never died, would appear to some great tzaddikim of the generation and teach them the way heavenly, the operations of heaven. The Arizal learned his Kabbalah from Giloy Eliyahu. The Ramak, I'm not sure how that worked, but Shimon Bar Yochai and the Arizal both learned directly from Eliyahu Hanavi, who of course had a front seat in Shemayim, so he knows exactly what's going on in heaven. Okay, so I'm going to stop. One more question. I'm sorry. Oh yeah.
How does the Zohar compare to the Ramban's Kabbalah and Sefer HaBahir?
Yep, so here's the thing. The Ramban was before the Zohar was revealed. Sefer HaBahir is actually the earliest Kabbalistic work that we have, and that we had. So the Ramban did have Sefer HaBahir, and the Ramban would quote Sefer HaBahir. The Ramban does not quote the Zohar because the Zohar was not discovered until later. So obviously there are similarities, but there are also differences, and that's going to be a very big question. There were Rishonim who were Balei Kabbalah. The Ramban is the outstanding example. Rabbeinu Bechaya was also a great Makubal. The Rikanti, I have to check. Maybe he had the Zohar. I'm going to check this. But there were very definitely Rishonim who did not have access to the Zohar. And that creates a very interesting question. If they contradict the Zohar, does that kind of mean that we don't follow them on that particular issue?
Did the other Tanaim have different Kabbalah? Like, did Rabbi Akiva have his own Kabbalah?
It could very well be, just like the Ramak and the Ari later had different views of Kabbalah. You had Rav Nechunya ben Akana, who is the author of Bahir. You have Sefer Yetzirah, which some connect to Avraham Avinu or Adam HaRishon, even. These are they're pre-Zohar. They're older than the Zohar itself. They're older than Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, even. And to some degree, there were different Masoros. There are machloks in Kabbalah as well. I just wanted to one thing, as you're running late, that I had mentioned that a klal in poskim is when there's a machlokes, the Zohar and the Gemara, you follow the Gemara. But the Vilna Gaon wrote that there is no machlokes at all between the Zohar and the Gemara. If you think there's a machlokes, you either do not understand the Gemara properly, or you don't understand the Zohar properly. That if you truly understand the Zohar and the Gemara claimed there would never be a machlokes. Again, this is a big chiddush because b'pashtus there are many machloksim. But the Gra says a deep understanding will show you that all of these machloksim can be and should be resolved. Okay, this was an introduction to something. I'll just tell you what I was going to talk about, but I'll talk about it next time. And that is the Zohar itself, whatever it's dating, whether it's Shimon Bar Yochai or Moshe D'Leon, actually is not a single book. There are many, many different books in the Zohar that have their own names that were put together. So I'll talk next time a little bit about the different Masechtas, just like Shas, like Zohar is like Shas, right? Shas has Maseches Brachos, Maseches Shabbos. So the Zohar has things that are like Masechtos within the Zohar itself that we refer to by different names. Safra, the Tzniasa, the Idra, etc. These are what you might call Masechtos within the Zohar. Okay, we'll talk about that next time. I had mentioned I'm not going to be here tomorrow, unfortunately, so next class is Wednesday.
Thank you for listening to this Samayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.